never planned for this to happen. One night, one decision, that's all it took to change everything. It started with a glance, a conversation, a moment of hesitation. I could have walked away. I should have walked away. But I didn't. And now, there's no going back. I hadn't been going out much lately. Most of my days were spent at home, pacing between rooms that had long lost their warmth. My husband, Richard, was always busy, wrapped up in his work, barely present except in fleeting moments of routine. Retirement was never in his plans. He thrived in the chaos of his career, leaving me to navigate the quiet loneliness that had settled into my bones. This weekend was no different. Richard was out of town, another business trip taking him away, and I found myself staring out the window at the rain drizzling over the London streets. The glow of the streetlights made the wet pavement shimmer, casting golden reflections on the quiet road. I exhaled, pressing my fingertips against the cool glass. The silence in the house was suffocating, and I refused to endure another night trapped in it. So I made a decision. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the crisp autumn air brushing against my skin. The streets were littered with damp leaves, the scent of rain and earth filling the air as I made my way toward the Finch, my favorite little bar tucked away on a side street. It was one of those rare places that hadn't caved to modern trends, still holding on to its mismatched chairs, faded red booths, and the scent of aged wood soaked with ale. A relic of the past, much like I sometimes felt. By the time I reached the bar, the warmth inside was a stark contrast to the chill outside. The hum of quiet conversations and clinking glasses filled the space, a welcome distraction from the emptiness of my home. I slid onto a stool by the counter, ordered a gin and tonic, and let my thoughts drift. And then, I noticed him. He was sitting in the farthest corner of the bar, just slightly out of place. He wasn't nursing a pint like the older patrons scattered around him. No deep lines on his face, no graying hair. Even from a distance, I could tell he was younger. Mid-20s at most. For a moment, our eyes met. It was fleeting, accidental, but in that brief connection, something stirred inside me. He gave a small, hesitant smile, almost as if he was as surprised to see me as I was to notice him. I looked away quickly, feeling a rush of heat rise to my cheeks. It had been years since something as simple as eye contact made my stomach tighten. But I could feel it, his gaze lingering, unsure yet intrigued. I took a slow sip of my drink, the cool liquid calming the warmth creeping up my neck. When I glanced back at him over the rim of my glass, his eyes locked onto mine again. This time, he didn't look away. But there was hesitation there, a silent question, as if waiting to see whether I would acknowledge the moment or dismiss it. He looked down at his hands, exhaling softly. A nervous habit, maybe. But then, as though making a decision, he rose from his seat. I watched as he made his way across the bar, his grip tightening around the glass in his hand. He wasn't entirely confident, not in the way of men used to approaching strangers. There was a hesitance to his steps, a flicker of doubt. But beneath it, something else. A quiet boldness. As he stopped a few feet away, I could tell he was searching for the right words. There was an accent in his voice when he finally spoke, not completely foreign, but not quite London-born either. I tilted my head slightly, letting a playful smile curl at the corners of my lips. There was something about him, an energy that both intrigued me and unsettled me. He was younger, yes, but not naive. Something in his posture, the way he held himself, suggested he wasn't unfamiliar with situations like this. Still, there was a sincerity in his uncertainty, an openness in the way he watched me, as if unsure whether he had already crossed a line. I gestured toward the empty seat next to me, my fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of the bar. He hesitated for only a second before sitting down, his movements slightly too quick, as if my silent invitation had caught him off guard. Up close, I could see him more clearly, the sharp angles of his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted against the rim of his glass. His name, as he eventually told me, was Oliver. A classic name, one that suited him surprisingly well. There was a charm to him, something understated yet undeniable. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular, the city, the way London had changed over the years, the kind of small talk that usually fades into the background. But there was an underlying current beneath our words, something neither of us acknowledged outright. And maybe that was what made it all the more intoxicating. I watched the way his lips moved when he spoke, the way his fingers traced invisible patterns on the bar top. He was watching me, too, studying my expressions as if searching for signs of permission. A strange thought passed through my mind, one I quickly buried. I was just enjoying the moment. That was all. At least, that's what I told myself. But as the night stretched on, I knew deep down that this wasn't just casual conversation. And I had no idea where it was going to lead. The night air was crisp as we stepped out of the Finch, the lingering warmth of gin and conversation still buzzing under my skin. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, making the city streets glow under the streetlights. I hadn't planned to leave with him, but when Oliver stood, reaching for his coat, something inside me didn't want the night to end just yet. We walked side by side, our steps slow, unhurried. London felt different at this hour, quieter, more intimate. The chatter of bars faded behind us, leaving only the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic sound of our shoes against wet pavement. Neither of us spoke for a while, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was charged, expectant, as if words might break whatever spell we had unintentionally woven between us. Oliver kept his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. Every so often, he glanced at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I could tell he was still figuring this out, this moment, this connection, whatever it was. I was, too. I should have gone home. I should have said goodbye at the door of the bar and let the night dissolve into nothing but a harmless memory. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself enjoy the way his presence made me feel lighter, as though the weight of the years and the quiet loneliness had lifted, even if just for a little while. We reached the river, the lights reflecting on the slow-moving water, the scent of damp stone and autumn leaves filling the air. Oliver stopped near the railing, resting his hands on the cold metal. I watched as he took a slow breath, staring out at the water as if searching for the right thing to say. "London feels different at night," he finally murmured. His voice was quiet, but steady. I leaned against the railing beside him, gazing at the way the city lights shimmered across the river. "Everything feels different at night." He turned his head slightly, studying me. "I imagine you've seen the city change a lot over the years." There was no malice in his words, no patronizing tone, just curiosity. I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "And I imagine it still feels new to you." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but he didn't deny it. "I moved here 2 years ago," he admitted. "Thought I'd escape the quiet of the countryside, find something more exciting." I traced my fingers along the cool metal of the railing, considering his words. "And have you?" He exhaled a soft laugh. "Not quite like this." His eyes met mine then, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us felt smaller, the air charged with something neither of us had put a name to yet. I should have looked away, but I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch, let the tension settle into my bones, let myself feel something I hadn't in far too long. "You're different," Oliver said suddenly. His voice was quieter this time, more deliberate. I raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering at the edges of my lips. "Different from what?" "From what I expected," he admitted. "From most people I meet." I turned to him fully then, watching the way he shifted under my gaze. He was confident in some ways, unsure in others. He had been holding back all evening, careful, testing the waters. I leaned in just slightly, my voice low. "And what did you expect?" He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. "I don't know," he said after a pause. "But not this. Not this. Not me." I should have been offended. But I wasn't. Because I understood exactly what he meant. For years, I had felt like I was slowly fading into the background, becoming part of the furniture of my own life, seen but unnoticed, existing but not really living. And yet, in this moment, with the way Oliver was looking at me, I felt seen. Really seen. And I liked it. Too much. The mist curled around us, the city humming softly in the background. A part of me wanted to pull away, to break whatever was happening before it crossed into something I couldn't undo. But another part of me, a deeper, quieter part, wanted to see just how far we could take this. Because, for the first time in years, I wasn't just Eleanor, the wife waiting for her husband to come home. I was something more. And I wasn't ready to let that feeling slip away just yet. The walk back to my place felt longer than it should have. Maybe because every step carried the weight of a decision I hadn't fully made yet. The streets were nearly empty, the rain now nothing more than a fine mist clinging to my skin, cooling the warmth that had settled deep in my chest. Oliver walked beside me, hands tucked into his pockets, his jaw set in quiet contemplation. He hadn't asked where we were going. Maybe he already knew. Maybe neither of us needed to say it out loud. At some point, our hands brushed. A fleeting touch, barely there, but enough to send a pulse of awareness through me. I didn't move away. Neither did he. By the time we reached my street, the silence between us was thick with something unspoken. The house loomed ahead, dark, still, untouched by the electricity buzzing in my veins. I stopped a few doors down, hesitating. My pulse thrummed against my ribs. This was the moment where I could still turn back, still pretend this was nothing more than a casual encounter, a simple distraction from the monotony of my life. I should have told him goodnight. I should have let him walk away. Instead, I exhaled slowly and turned to face him. Oliver watched me carefully, his expression unreadable. There was no assumption in his gaze, no expectation. Just quiet curiosity, as if he was waiting to see which way the night would turn. I wasn't sure myself. "Would you like to come in?" The words were out before I had fully processed them, slipping into the damp air between us. For a moment, he didn't react. Then, slowly, he nodded. I swallowed hard and led the way up the steps, unlocking the door with steady hands that didn't match the storm brewing inside me. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of home wrapped around me, wood polish, faint traces of Richard's cologne lingering in the hallway. A sharp contrast to the warmth still thrumming beneath my skin. I flicked on the light. The soft glow illuminated the quiet space, revealing framed photographs on the wall, the neatly arranged bookshelf, the coat Richard had left hanging by the door before he left. Oliver hesitated just inside the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the room. I could almost see the shift in his posture as realization settled over him. The house wasn't just mine. His eyes flicked to the row of men's shoes lined up near the door. He didn't say anything, but I saw the brief tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed at his sides. "You're married," he said finally. Not a question, just a quiet statement of fact. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier. I turned away, slipping off my coat, buying myself a few extra seconds to gather my thoughts. "Yes," I admitted, my voice even. "But he's not here." Silence. I finally looked at Oliver, expecting to see hesitation, maybe even regret. But instead, his expression was unreadable, his gaze steady, searching. "Does he know you're here?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I let out a soft breath, shaking my head. "No." Oliver exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. For a moment, I thought he might leave. That he would turn around and walk out the door, untangling himself from whatever this was before it became something he couldn't take back. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped further inside, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. I wasn't sure who crossed the distance first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. All I knew was that one moment there was space between us, and the next there wasn't. My back was against the wall before I could process what was happening. His scent, warm, fresh, mixed with the faintest trace of rain, filled my senses as his fingers hovered just shy of my waist, like he was waiting for permission he wasn't sure I would give. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it went too far. But instead, I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "You can still leave," I murmured, though I knew we had already crossed that point. Oliver's fingers tightened slightly at his sides, his jaw clenching. His breathing had changed, slower, heavier. "Do you want me to?" A loaded question. One that neither of us wanted to answer. I shook my head. Just once. A barely there movement. But it was enough. Oliver exhaled slowly, his eyes darkening with something I hadn't seen before. Something dangerous. something that made my stomach flip in a way I hadn't felt in years. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just about desire. It was about the fact that, for the first time in so long, I felt awake. And I wasn't ready to let that feeling go. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway. I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow, matching the quickened pulse beneath my skin. The door was closed now, the outside world sealed away, leaving just the two of us in the dim glow of the living room lamp. Oliver stood a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. The air between us felt charged, crackling with an unspoken question neither of us wanted to ask outright. I moved first. Not toward him, but toward the small bar cart in the corner of the room. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for a bottle of whiskey, pouring 2 drinks in an attempt to steady myself. I wasn't sure if I was trying to calm my nerves or delay what was about to happen. Maybe both. I turned and offered him a glass. He hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his fingers brushing against mine as he took it. A small, fleeting touch. But enough. He took a sip, then exhaled slowly. "This feels dangerous," he murmured, his voice lower now. I smiled slightly, lifting my own glass to my lips. "Does that bother you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me, his gaze tracing the contours of my face, as if trying to understand exactly what kind of game we were playing. "I just don't think you're the type to do something reckless," he finally said. I let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Then maybe you don't know me as well as you think." His expression shifted at that, something flickering behind his eyes, something unreadable. The truth was, I didn't recognize myself in this moment either. I had spent so many years carefully constructing a life that was predictable, stable, safe. But now, standing here in the soft glow of my living room, with a man who wasn't my husband looking at me like I was something worth unraveling, I felt something I hadn't in years. I felt alive. And I didn't want to let that feeling go. Oliver set his drink down on the table beside him, then slowly, deliberately, took a step closer. I didn't move. Not away. Not forward. Just stood there, waiting. Waiting for him to either cross the line we both knew had already begun to blur, or to turn around and walk away before we both did something we couldn't take back. His eyes searched mine, looking for hesitation, for regret. He wouldn't find any. "Tell me to go," he said softly. I swallowed. He was giving me an out. A chance to stop this before it went any further. I could tell him to leave. I could remind him of the ring on my finger, of the man who shared this house with me, even if he wasn't here now. I could do the right thing. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped forward, closing the last bit of space between us. Oliver inhaled sharply, his hands flexing at his sides, as if he was resisting the urge to reach for me. I tilted my head slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want me to?" His breath hitched. And then, finally, the last bit of restraint snapped. His hand came up to cup the side of my face, fingers brushing along my jaw, testing, searching. My skin burned beneath his touch, every nerve in my body coming alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. Because, deep down, I had already made my choice the moment I invited him inside. There was no turning back now.